I serve DHEC primarily as infectious disease consultant epidemiologist for the coastal regions, regional medical director for Region 6, serve under Dr. Simkovich here, Region 7 as a consultant. For several years, I co-chaired the Pandemic Influenza Ethics Task Force. I teach at MUSC, and I also serve on the Board of Medical Examiners from Congressional District 1 and associate editor of the journal. Many of you may have seen last year's June issue of the journal. The June issue is always the DHEC public health issue. Last year was on crisis standards of care, mainly referencing pandemic influenza. The June issue this year, 2012, will be focused on nuclear and radiation and other disasters, which I will comment on here. I can't miss the opportunity to thank Dr. Max Lerner, Director of the Office of Public Health Preparedness, who works with Dr. Finkley and others so closely. He gave a superb talk and allowed me to use several of his slides in my talk here. You saw this earlier. This is the Fukushima Daiichi Japan reactors prior to the undersea earthquakes and tsunamis, which destroyed the electric power generators in several fashions, not only in wiping out the diesel fuel, but in actually destroying the generators which were above ground, and the tsunamis literally tore apart the generators. So without the generators, the cooling components of the nuclear plants malfunctioned, and they went nuclear, so to speak. And here are some pictures taken in over the ensuing few months. You can see here in the upper right an explosion, literally a nuclear, low-level nuclear explosion from one of the plants. In the upper left, although you can't read the fine print, it does explain some of the reactor damages that Mr. Williamson mentioned in his first talk. Smoke and dust plumes fortunately went more offshore, and in fact the U.S. Navy recorded triple levels of cesium 50 on one of their ships 50 miles out at sea. And so they had the sailors get off the decks of the ship. The estimates of the fallout damage by the Japanese government were grossly understated to start with. There is now significant mistrust in the Japanese government by the population, as you've heard Dr. Finkley mention. And in the lower right hand, a close-up of one of the destroyed plants. I think this is Unit 3 here. So it was indeed a major disaster, arguably the world's worst nuclear disaster, surpassing Chernobyl. Some of the other points of fallout from the Fukushima disasters include initially, within the first month, at least 15,850 deaths, displacement of at least 340,000 people. Estimated costs based on a variety of reliable websites are from $227 to $279 billion, US dollars 2011, and continue to rise. The amount of radiation release compared to the 1945 Hiroshima bomb was estimated by various experts as from 168 times the 45 bomb to 72,000 times that. So tremendous amount of radiation release. The contamination zone, no human habitation for decades or generations, was initially 10, then 20 kilometers. And Sam, am I right? That is likely to expand a bit more. I heard on the news that they may expand.
Out to the northwest.
Yes, yes, particularly to the northwest. That is not only no human habitation, but there's radiation contamination of the crops, which are going to make them inedible for generations. The fishing off the coast for a large distance, and other industries in Japan have suffered likewise. And there are global ramifications, especially since much of the debris, some of which is radioactive, has been spreading across the Pacific Ocean, and we've already seen some evidence here. Here's a picture taken from an independent source, but put on the CNN website recently, of just piles of floating debris from rooftops to here's an overturned boat to all sort of other debris. The debris field is estimated at the present to be about 1.5 million tons, and some of it has already begun to wash up over the Alaska and our western coast already, and is scattered in various areas over the Pacific. Next slide shows at the top up here CNN in Tunguska, Alaska. Here's garbage and floats. It's fishing boat floats from Japan hitting up in Alaska already. Although our government scientists say, quote, highly unlikely that there is significant radiation in the debris, end quote, they have found 3 times levels in this debris. And then just this week, on Tuesday, on CNN, there was a lengthy interview with this professor, Dr. Nicholas Fisher, Stony Brook, who's a radiation expert. And he and his colleagues and others have found that there is radiation in fish, particularly tuna, but at small levels, 3% more radioactive since the nuclear disaster. Not enough to cause significant human radiation poisoning by eating the fish, particularly raw fish, and the lower picture shows typical tuna sushi. And these bluefin tuna have been contaminated, but again, at low levels. If you think about it a minute, tuna contaminated by mercury poisoning poses a greater health risk than this small amount of radioactivity. But we're just beginning to learn of the long-term ecological effects throughout the entire Pacific, just like it's taken us 1 to 2 years to learn about the long-term ecological effects of the Deepwater Horizon disaster. In the upper right here is an article that appeared in yesterday's Charleston Post-Courier, Cell phone monitoring radiation to be sold in Japan. Dr. Finkley mentioned that citizens are mistrusting the government, and you mentioned the farmer who tested his crops and found significant level of radiation in the rice. One of the cell phone manufacturers, SoftBank, carrier for the hit iPhone and iPad, as the main carrier, have now built in to their phones radiation monitors looking at microsieverts per hour at the push of a button. Obviously, they're going to be expensive, but the Japanese are now snatching up these phones. In the lower right shows the phone with the microsieverts and the location based on GPS of that. So high technology is now in the hands of the average citizen there to see how much radiation they're being exposed to at that point and place. Now again, a slide thanks to Dr. Lerner, and whenever you see this number sign in the upper right-hand corner, that's a slide thanks to Max Lerner. Nuclear facilities affecting South Carolina. We see these that include the Savannah Riverside, of course, and the V.C. Sumner plant and others. Notice that there are none along the coast. Unfortunately, Japan placed their series of reactors along the coast and could not imagine the earthquake tsunami effect. So that was the unthinkable. We doubt very seriously that nuclear reactors would be placed along our coast now for the learning from the lessons of the Japanese. Perhaps wind power, turbine wind power off our coast may be a wiser and greener alternative energy source. Although the purpose of today's seminar is focusing on nuclear and radiation disasters, there are other types of disasters that we should keep in mind. We've already seen the massive Russian Chernobyl nuclear explosion with a no human habitation zone of at least 12 kilometers now. The 3 Mile Island plant incident with significant radiation release. The horrific 1984 Bhopal, India release of isocyanate, basically cyanide that killed anywhere from 50 to 100,000 people, accidental release. Although that was non-nuclear, it was again just an example of a massive global disaster. The Love Canal, 1953, waste contamination caused excess deaths, not immediately again, but long term, and displacement of thousands of people. It led to actually to the creation of the EPA Superfund program. That was the trigger that created the Superfund program. And then most recently, the Deepwater Horizon disaster in the Gulf of Mexico in April 2010, long-lasting harm to very fragile aquatic and coastal ecosystems. Of course, here in South Carolina, we have the constant threat of hurricanes, tornadoes, storms, flooding, etc. This, as I mentioned, will be mentioned in the June 2010 issue of the Journal of the State Medical Association. Obviously, our greatest concern has been and continues to be hurricanes. And here's Hurricane Hugo coming in, landed as a Cat 4 the evening of Thursday, September the 21st, and the massive evacuation from the coast at the last minute with 14-hour drive from Charleston to Columbia. Just one picture of the aftermath of Hurricane Hugo. The boats all piled up on Goat Island behind the Isle of Palms gives you an idea of the massive destructive power of a hurricane like this. And then here is a picture of a huge storm out west, and it's going to lead to a massive EF5 tornadoes, not unlike the EF5 tornado that hit Joplin, Missouri in May last year, that caused an estimated $3 billion in damage, killed 162 people, and it tore through the town very slowly and just devastated the entire town. It's taken that town a whole year to rebuild just half of Main Street. So massive storms like this are not only likely but possible, and are increasingly likely as climate change causes the storms to be stormier, the hots to be hotter, the colds to be colder, and displacement of all sorts of things. Well, I mentioned that the journal last year focused on the pandemic, and yes, we have had a recent pandemic, the so-called swine flu, or now called PDM09, type A, subtype H1N1, which is still in our vaccines today, by the way. And this fall, we will see the first ever human quadrivalent vaccines, 4 components instead of 3, which will still include swine flu. All the other components are changing. Swine flu is still around, will still be with us. Again, to give a graphic example of a non-nuclear mass casualty disaster, this graphic, courtesy of our late friend Dr. Tom Fabian at DHEC, shows the pandemic influenza, so-called Spanish flu, although it was really an American flu, of troops returning home to Boston and Philadelphia in 1918 in September. And week after week, if you look at the timeline on the bottom, week after week, this spread rapidly throughout the country. And this is in the days before we had interstates and airplanes. This is simply horse and buggy and railroad transportation. Very contagious strain. The lethality of the strain was only 2 to 5% kill rate, but when you infect millions of people, you get lots of deaths. We worry now about pandemics, and the most likely mode of transportation of the next pandemic, whether it's flu or any other virus in the world, is this bird right here, the airplane. And so that leads us to ask ourselves the question, what about global air travel? In this graphic, if you look at global air travel, this is one day mid-2009, shows the night-day line now having come over Asia. And look at Eastern Asia, China, etc. The yellows represent each one airplane. Now, Europe is now in daylight, and Europe is just covered in air traffic. It's at nighttime in the United States, relatively low air traffic, but as daylight approaches, the East Coast lights up in air traffic, and the West Coast will soon light up. But it gives you a simple, quick graphic demonstration of how rapidly we can transport a pathogen from one spot to another, or how rapidly a terrorist bomb or even the plane itself as a weapon can be used when you consider the huge number of airplanes in the air and the security measures that have been and continue to be taken. I would not be I would be remiss if I failed to mention that around the Charleston, Somerville area, we have the largest earthquake fault line east of the Mississippi. And although we have no nuclear plants right over this fault line, this is a very significant fault line. As we see here from the pictures, again, thanks to Dr. Lerner, Tuesday, August 31st, 1886, the Great Charleston earthquake that killed hundreds and destroyed half the city of Charleston. So we're due for another earthquake, yes, and have had tremors in the Somerville, Charleston area frequently. Would also be remiss if I failed to mention the changes caused by global climate change, global warming, emerging infectious diseases. There are a variety of factors here. As the sea ice melts, the ocean heat content rises, temperature rises, glaciers melt, and these are all measurable indicators of climate change and global warming. There's no doubt that global warming exists. There can be reasonable debate among intelligent people as to the percent of the global warming that is contributed by man as opposed to natural events like volcanoes. But the warming as an absolute event is real. There are a number of emerging infectious diseases, my area of specialty, that are attributable directly or indirectly to climate change. And I just point out this global map. Each of these with an asterisk by them are related in one way, shape, or form to the climate change that we are seeing. And now we have, for example, dengue fever endemic in Florida and in southern parts of Texas, whereas we have never had it endemic in the United States before. Imported cases, yes, but not endemic cases. Now, having hit Florida, become endemic there, and up to the level of the Everglades, and the warmer the climate gets, then more mosquitoes will travel north. There are a number of human health impacts related to climate change, and on the left column we see the event types, on the right column the health impacts from direct health effects to vector-borne diseases, particularly infectious diseases, mosquito-borne, migration particularly, that causes huge impacts on population, especially when we lack agricultural resources. And I probably should have added war, displacement, and the various side effects on health impacts there too. Now, in the June issue, my editorial will include this paragraph to directly addressing doctors, physician extenders, meaning PAs and APRNs that we depend on so much in the clinical world to help us see patients and do our jobs. When a mass disaster strikes, where will you be and what will you be doing? Will you evacuate the area with your family, as so many did in New Orleans during Katrina in August 2007, or will you shelter in place at home, as some recommend to avoid outdoor exposure? Dr. Finkley has mentioned sheltering in place, and if you are downwind in a plume from a nuclear release, yes, that's a wise thing to do. Or if we have another type of disaster, such as a hurricane, will you try to open your office or report to a local hospital or other healthcare facility to help render first aid and help out? And in the case of a hurricane, that may be wise. In the case of an earthquake, for example, in the Charleston area, half of the bridges may go out and providers will be unable to go to their hospital of choice, and that's why Region 7, DHEC, has put in place a number of Western shelters around the county to provide spots for first aid treatment. And for physicians, many believe that it's up to the emergency rooms to do all of the response. And Dr. Shelton from Palmetto Richland, who is part of our planning team statewide, says, no, it really does not depend on being an emergency room doctor because all physicians and physician extenders have a role, even if they're subspecializing in something totally different than first aid or first response. So they can be a helper. Some may even be heroes in this response. But the question is, will they have sufficient training to really know what to do in most or all of these various disaster scenarios? More urgently, if you're in the proximity of an isolated disaster with mass casualties, and here a dirty bomb is my worst nightmare, because not only do you have the immediately injured, bleeding, and dying victims, and some already dead, but you have the radiation contamination, which actually creates more fear and panic than it does direct casualties, because it's very hard